Could I ask you something about Split the Difference, the organization?
You can ask me anything you want.
The organization
Phone number
started. What is how is the organization structured? What is your aim of Split the Difference? What is the future? What's the plan?
Okay, so the plan is very clean and clear because it took me like 3.5 years to put the strategy together. So I got a lot of business experience behind me. So we have a clear campaign plan. We have tasks that are planned within the next 12 months and then they lead on 24 months. This year now, for the next 12 months, we are actively building committees in each country. So we're targeting specific people that have got experience in the 13 areas. There are 13 areas that were common denominators out of the research across each country that we looked at. They were very strong, very clear, very visible, and they were the hardest barriers that men were experiencing. So there's 13 areas. So we've got a drive now for the next 6 to 12 months to get committee members in every country, every UN member country. Those committee members will have specific skills around those 13 areas. And then the aim is that when we've got these committees on board, then there's a strategy on what we plan on doing. Like, for example, I've applied for a petition to UK government. That committee in each country would then be asked to do that with their own governments. We are very mindful around health and safety, and we're following, there's an organisation called Reporters Without Borders. They measure what's safe for reporters, what countries are safe, and we're using that as an evaluation to risk manage for the committees, because we wouldn't want anybody to be in harm while challenging. So we've got some soft touch stuff if the country is not safe to be petitioned against. But we will ask them all to petition. So we've got common tasks for those committees that we will share. Over a 12-month period, those committee members will, every 3 months, you will visibly see the committees doing something together. So at every 3-month period, we will do a lot of media around tasks that we share that connects us together. And then we've got one aim really, and that is that we've applied to the UN requesting that they review legislation, that they include men and boys throughout all of their legislation, policy or strategic planning, including fiscal spending, or they make them gender neutral. And the reason for that is because once one of the barriers for men receiving services or recognition for their needs, which is what governed me, there wasn't recognition for needs for men in their own communities. Okay, so their needs are not assessed and they're not catered for. So, but the barrier to that is if somebody is not named, if a gender is not named in an act of law and legislation, as that cascades down into frontline services, they will be excluded, and anything they request will be fought against. You just don't get it. I mean, the prime example, Women's Aid in the UK at the moment are requesting, I watched the TV, Parliament TV, they're looking at 400 million funding in the UK now with the new domestic abuse bill, and men's services get less than 1% of that, and there's a reason for that. So you go from legislation into policy, into strategic planning, and as you go down that cascades, if you're not mentioned in there, you're not part of it, and that's all there is to it. So and
obviously there's a cycle, because they train teachers, they train police, they train the NHS, and they only look for female victims and male perpetrators, which obviously exaggerates the statistics to give them more funding.
Exactly. I mean, systematically, where men sit in the world, in a system base, they are almost non-existent, and that is in education, in health. Anybody will stand up and say, "Oh, Sally, but it's just automatically assumed that they will be served." Well, that's not true. And when you look at things like, for example, with the domestic abuse bill now, I can guarantee you that all funding is waiting for that to be reviewed completely, the stamp on it, and it goes out in the world. And you'll have police and crime commissioners who are waiting for that. You'll have education departments. You'll have child protection of vulnerable adults. They will all be looking at what does that domestic abuse bill say? And then once it's been released, they will assess their own internal policies, assess their training. Have we got staff that are appropriate to the needs that are stated within that legislation? And everything will be governed around that. If a man and a boy is not mentioned in that, then forget it.
Yeah.
Just forget it. It's not even worth the paper it's written on for a man or a boy. Sorry, go on.
I can give you an example from Scotland. Because of COVID, there was a new strategy for homelessness in connection with domestic abuse. And in the strategy, there was no mention of men and boys, even though men are, especially in regards to rough sleeping, men are the vast majority with 85%, but they were completely excluded. And I wrote to the people that wrote this paper, and I had a exchange in emails, and it was just complete women's aid rhetoric and feminist rhetoric. And in the end, they mentioned a document. They actually mentioned that document because men and boys were mentioned together with LGBT victims, because men and LGBT are always mentioned in one thing, because men are a minority group. And that was the best practice strategy for homelessness and domestic abuse, and it was written by Women's Aid and completely excluded men, with the exception of one sentence where it says men and LGBT victims might be victims of domestic abuse as well. That
I find
sorry, go on.
I find it
there was no help. There was no help for them addressed at all.
I find it so interesting that they, you know, if you don't use a gender neutral word, say like firefighter or police officer or congressperson, in, you know, a book or a statement or television show or whatever, their campaign will go ballistic, and there will be letters and there will be anarchy, and, you know, it'll be trending on Twitter, whatever. But if a law gets passed that does not include males as half the population in a legal aid for domestic violence, it's complete silence. You know, so like, yeah, they're obsessed with gender when it's women who have been forgotten, no matter to what minority, what tiny insignificant extent. But if men are forgotten at the top levels of legal practices, that doesn't matter, and we don't care. And that's something for someone else to sort out. We're busy sorting women out.
I think with the domestic abuse bill, I spent about 4 weekends ago, I spent 4 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, watching parliamentary TV. And out of what I watched, because I was watching domestic abuse stuff, out of what I watched, I then looked at the stuff they were doing around COVID, because there's been lots of panels and lots of research and lots of quick response things coming out from Parliament. And I looked at equality, because there was lots of things going on around, you know, COVID was an increase in domestic abuse, and there was lots of, this was in the news heavily. And I looked at equality because I looked at a lot of the meeting papers. They're not published stuff, they're things that you can bring up, but you've got to go looking for them. And I looked at it, and inequality, which out of all of the parliamentary kind of legislative documentation and the committees, that should be untouchable in any way, shape or form. It should be the one factor that actually looks at all aspects. And I read this paperwork from these meetings, and it was all women and girls, women and girls, women and girls. No men's mentioned, not one man, not one statement. And you can't, when you've got that going on, you think it's done, it's a done deal. The only thing that you can do now is get up off your seat and do something about it, and that's it. You know, in the most clear kind of planned, structured, purposeful actions that are polite to everybody's needs, but nevertheless you get up, you stand up, and you do something about it, and that's it. There's no other options anymore. There just isn't, you know.
The organization Men and Women Working Together that you know of, one of their main goals, which I completely support, is to get a minister for men. And I'm interested in Liz, yours opinion, and obviously your Sally Ann's opinion as well. What do you think about that? How important is that?
I fully support it too. I think, I can see the argument, that's been presented by some that there shouldn't be an office, for women or for men. But I think that, we've got the Office for Women and Equalities and it's not going away. And there are so many issues faced by men and boys that need careful and conscientious kind of looking at by our politicians, that I think it's really important. And, the other concern that's raised is that whoever will be appointed as the minister and whoever will sit on it will be, indoctrinated into feminist ways of thinking, and, they'll be kind of producing the caliber or the spirit of stuff that the APA guidance on masculinity was putting out. And that is a valid concern, and in which case the office would be purely symbolic for the time being. But I do think that the public are becoming a lot more knowledgeable and a lot more concerned about men's and boys' issues, and they will, it will filter into Parliament at some point. They're going to be voting people in. I mean, look at Shipley in the last general election. The Women's Equality Party spent so much money and had so much media coverage, and really tried to trash Philip Davies. And yet his constituents voted him in again with a solid majority. So, I think that it might be an investment in the future, but we need it ASAP.
Het, what do you think?
I was actually going to say that exactly what Elizabeth has just been talking about. I would guess if we introduced it tomorrow that it would be symbolic, and that the person who is in the position, almost inevitably Jess Phillips, would say, that I've had a look at men and I've concluded that they're arseholes. And so what we need to do is get rid of masculinity, and that is my official position as the Minister for Men. But Elizabeth is right. It's better to have it than not have it, even if it wasn't immediately useful. There's nothing to lose by putting it in. There's everything to gain by putting it in. And one day it may be genuinely important, in the sense that it might actually be more than just a feminist concession. It may move into being actually functional.
Yeah.
Sally Ann?
I looked at this a little while, and I think that when human beings don't like having something taken away from them. So you're never going to get rid of the women's movement within Parliament now. Your best option is to align a male equivalent alongside all of that. So you have got that counterbalance. Once that person is put in place, the systems that wrap around him will have to shift with that space, regardless of who it is, whether it's a positive lead or a negative lead currently. The spaces will have to be made for that person, their job role, where they're going to fit into each committee, the impact they're going to have on each decision that's made, whatever that might be coming out of Parliament. So the very act of putting somebody in place will shift a space to allow somebody to walk in there. And regardless of who it is, whoever steps into that place, they are accountable. They will, by their nature, they will be accountable. So you've got you've got a department that is challengeable from that point onwards. So you've got to start in. I mean, hopefully you wouldn't have a negative, but if you do, it's going to be very difficult for him to remain that way. He will either step out or he will push forward and be the better person. He's only got two options really. For me, the power is in the space around him. You know, though, I mean, for example, if he's going to be in situ, he will automatically be part of the equalities, you know, and the diversity and the human rights. He will automatically become part of anything that's going through review for legislation, because he will have to be. So the pathways to all of those systems will have to open up for him. They will, without a doubt. So for me, it's a no-brainer. Do it. And everybody get behind him, because they would be very difficult to be denied. How could you deny that? How could the government actually deny that? You know, if everybody's behind him, with them, I mean, it's great, men and women working together is amazing, but it's undeniable. It just simply is. So yeah, for me, I'm like, yeah, I'll be there. What do you want me to do? I'll do it. Whatever I can do to support, I will.
I think it's a great foot in the door, and just by electing a minister for men, it would make headlines, and people would say, oh yeah, there are issues with men. It would just start the debate, and from that point on, it would be undeniable. And also exactly what you said, as soon as there's a minister for men who participates in equality conversations, as you said correctly, at the moment, men are not being mentioned once, just 0 times. If the minister for men is there, he would have to speak up at least once, and that is infinitely more than we have at the moment. And even if the person was more on the feminist side, he would have to speak up. And also, it's much easier for like the Women's Inequalities Commissioner or Minister to ignore men's groups. But for a man's minister, he can't ignore them. He might work with organizations that are more on the feminist side, like Respect, but at one point he would have to work with Mankind and with the Man and Boys Coalition, because otherwise, like, wait a minute, why are you not working with them? And it would be hard for him to explain why. So
accountability, there's a pathway to accountability, you know, and for me, it doesn't matter who's in there. Once accountability is there, you've got a pathway to challenge. I mean, for example, you know, Mankind and lots of other men's group offered their services to be witnesses within the domestic abuse bill. I mean, can you imagine him denying that kind of input? Can you imagine, you know, what would he say? It would be pretty much impossible, because there's that accountability.